So it's been 50 million years since the last tier list video, but I'm finally here to hit y'all with the Gold Rider Servant tier list video. Now, I don't actually know when this will be going up because we have two other riders that are literally just about to hit the game on JP. Like literally we have Nikki and the other dude who I don't care about because it's not a big titty waifu. They're going to be dropping on the game in like a day or two, but I'm recording this before they come out. So if I don't add something on the end where it's just like, hey, these people are also gold riders, then either A, just too busy because your boy's on vacation, or B, I didn't care enough to do that, or C, a little bit of both. So just being fully transparent with you guys. But before we actually get into the video, this is going to be a longer one. Strap in. You know, you guys know how the tier lists go. If you haven't already, leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, all that good stuff. And, you know, if you want free ways to support the channel, I'm affiliated by all means with LD Emulator and Loot Cakes down in the description down below. They're both absolutely free. They're not going to get your account banned or anything. I know that's a little bit of a concern for some people. It's, you know, I wouldn't promote something that's going to literally get your account obliterated. I'm not going to do that to people. So, you know, it's a free way to support the channel, and I believe in their products and what they promote. So there's that. If you want to get extra content, you can follow my Twitch down in the description down below. Usually I stream every weekday, but yeah, I'm actually not home. I don't know if you guys can tell by the difference in quality and the more maybe sporadic upload times. I actually don't know how it's going so far with the schedule this week, but yeah, I'm on vacation, so maybe not going to be streaming very much until I get back from vacation. But you can also become a channel member, click that join button, get access to channel member only videos. Now, with all that being said, let's go ahead and move into this list. Now, starting off, we have Marie Antoinette, who, I mean, she's a bit of an unfortunate servant, right? Because she's got a good charisma, right? With a high chance of charm an enemy, especially with her third skill buffing the success of said charm, right? She has very high survivability with the fact that she has basically the coup dodge skill, but instead of dodge, it's invincibility. So it's actually way better because invincibility can only be removed by buff removal or pierced by pierce invincibility, whereas dodge can be pierced by sure hit or pierced invincibility. So it gives her really good survivability. Her NP removes all allies debuffs, which is a very, very crazy piece of utility. She admittedly does give a crit buff on her NP, but it's still pretty weak at only 20%. I don't really know what the point of giving a 20% crit buff to the entire party is. It's like they wanted to be this buffer, like utility tanky servant, but they didn't give her really enough in that avenue. And then she has like a lot of heals. Like she has like 2 or 3 things in her kit that revolve around healing, and it's just really not enough to really matter. And then her damage at the end of the day is really, really low. So with all that being said, she's going to be a solid C tier servant. Now, I actually did give them all rankings here. Like I have them at either like S, A, B, C, D, and then I have like a little plus or minus next to some of them. If I'm like, well, C minus is like they're the very low of the tier. They could potentially go lower. If they're like B plus, it's like they're the very top of that tier, and they could potentially get into A tier as well. So Marie is just a very solid C tier servant. Like as you guys can kind of see right here. Sorry, I'm a little tired from skiing today, but as you guys can see, I've named the tiers a little bit appropriately. Like I kind of would just, I think about each of the servants, but they do function as S, A, B, C, and D. And I just think that she's a very solid C tier servant. Like she has good survivability, and like you could tell that they wanted to be kind of a team support type servant, but she's not leaning into that enough to really make it worthwhile to use her unless you just really like Marie. Martha though, I have at C plus, right? Because Martha's kind of what Marie probably wants to be, just a little bit better, because she's basically immune to debuffs with skill 1. Skill 2 allows her to just be very good with the party-wide debuff cleanse, so it's a bit more immediate than, say, Marie's NP cleanse. You could argue that you could fire off Marie's a bit more often because it's an NP, but you know, how often are you going to really go out of your way to click Marie's cards to try to gen her NP specifically just to get the debuff cleanse in like a few turns? Whereas Martha, when you need it, you could pop it, and you're probably not going to need it until it cools down again. So that makes it very immediately more useful. Skill 3 is very nice because it removes one enemy's debuffs, and then it hits him with a big fat defensive down as well. So not only does this kind of function as a way to allow your allies to get around invincibility, high levels of defense, dodge, as long as the buffs aren't unremovable, so you can pretty much just yeet all of their buffs on them and then just smack them with an insane just hard-hitting NP, because she's also lowering their defense. Now, the only problem that I really have with Martha that I think really holds her back is her NP. I don't know why they're really trying to go with her having a damaging NP when they really should have leaned into the support aspect, right? Instead of trying to make it do more damage when they buff the NP, they really didn't do that at all whatsoever. They were like, we're just going to try to have her hit a bit harder, but it's like, no. If you look at her skills, she's very support oriented and her skills are pretty solid. You know, I would even say they're pretty good. It's just, they then just focus too hard on trying to give her a damaging NP when that's not her niche. Like, almost imagine if Merlin, instead of having his crazy good support NP, had in like an AoE mid damaging NP. You'd just be like, well, his skills are really good. I'd probably still use him occasionally, but I'm probably never going to use the NP, right? Like, there should be really no need to go ahead and do that. It's the same thing for Martha, but hopefully they can rebuff the NP again, and then hopefully just give it some support utility on there. I don't know, just party-wide attack buff, party buster buff, you know, maybe the defense down is just a bit more biting on that as well, but I'd rather it be like buster down so you can kind of have the defense down from the skill and then the buster down from the NP. I think that'd be really good. But then we move on to what I would say is like our first like proper good servant at A-, right? I have Drake over here, who could probably just be like a flat A as well. A- A is kind of where I'm sitting her, just because Drake, after all of her buffs, is just absolutely insane. Like, the first skill is very good as it gives the entire party an NP damage and an attack buff, right? Which is a double buff for the entire party. And it's falling off a little bit though because it only lasts for one turn and it needs to be brought up to the modern 20% values. But still, at its core, it's still very useful because you double buff the entire party. If you don't know, the NP damage buff and the attack buff that she gives to the party, they don't add into each other, they multiply into each other because they're different types of buffs, and different buff types are multiplicative in FGO. So it makes it a very, very good skill, even to this day, just because it inherently double buffs. And even though it does need to be buffed to brought up to the modern values and probably just make it 3 turns instead of 1 turn, it still has a very solid foundation, right? Because that's how they just built tactics early on in the game. The second skill is just absolutely insane because it gives her a massive amount of NP gain as well as Pierce defense, and alongside her third skill, which has Pierce invincibility, it literally just means that Drake can bypass whatever she wants in the game. I mean, unless you have Solemn defense, who we haven't even fought Castoria or anybody with Solemn defense yet, or they have some just crazy weird resistance that some bosses have, Drake can get through anything, right? And she can do pretty good damage to them, right? The Buster buff is nice. I understand why it's not super high because that would mean she's triple buffing herself with decent values, right? So they're like, okay, let's keep the NP damage, the attack buff, and the Buster buff that she gives to herself all at like lower values because that's a triple buff. That's a lot of damage that she's giving to herself. If they had that be like a 50% Buster buff, she would be absolutely insane though, right? The 50% battery is also insanely good. That's something you really do need to know when you talk about Drake. Because it gives her synergy with Koyanskaya now especially, so if you want a Buster loop, Drake is a premium rider to go ahead and go and get. Also, the fact that she's just not like a super limited servant and you can get her in any multi makes her pretty good as well. That's not really a plus to the servant, it just means like she's more accessible than some of the other riders that you might want to use for Buster farming, so not only is she a bit more accessible technically, but she also has a 50% battery, which is insanely good. The NP's a little basic, but it does drop stars for her to play around with. Unfortunately, she doesn't have any crit damage to herself, so that's kind of where I take off some points that, like, she kind of has everything she needs to be, like, a good crit servant, and maybe when they buff the first skill, they'll bring it to, like, 20% NP damage, 20% attack buff, and then be, like, 30% party-wide crit damage for, you know, 3 turns. I think that'd be really good, especially because her NP already drops a decent bit of stars for her and the party to play around with. You do that, and you have, like, an A+, potentially S-tier servant on your hands, which would just be, like, an insanely high-tier rider, right? But I mean, I should also note that if you're using somebody like Merlin or Koyanskaya, her not having her own crit buff usually isn't the biggest deal because crits are basically like what all Buster supports want to help them do, so you know, it kind of helps her out a bit. And then I should also note that her NP damage is also very good as well. Then we go back down to a bit more of a poo-poo stinky servant, and that's Anne and Bonnie. Now, they did get a little bit better when they buffed their skill. I mean, I would say that skill 1 actually makes them a unit now because they have the taunt, guts, and NP buff combo, which means they have the enemy attack them to try to get them to proc their gut so they're at 1 HP so they can do maximum damage, and then they get an insane NP gain buff as well, so as they're getting hit, hopefully by the time their guts procs and they die, they have 100% NP, so it's supposed to just be like a super mega conducive skill to what they want to do, right? And it's pretty good, right? Because then they can blast off some pretty good damage. They have 100% crit damage for that turn as well, which makes them pretty good. The decent star weight skill and a decent attack buff does mean that that turn where you fire off the NP, and if you have the crit buff up, they will look really nice. The problem is they will probably die the turn after that, and they're probably not going to last very long, because then they're going to be sitting at 1 HP just waiting to die, right? And then some bosses actually will attack you once, proc your guts, and then they'll attack you again and just finish off the servant. So sometimes, you know, it doesn't really work out the best. It's a bit more rare for some bosses. Usually it goes about the normal thing where, like, if a boss procs their guts, or if they kill the first member of your party, they'll stop attacking and they'll only be able to proc their skills. But some bosses are just built different, right? They'll just continue to attack you. So they're kind of weak to that. And it's really like they do a lot for what I would consider like not enough, right? Because, you know, I harp on characters like Skahawk or Rider Alter, right? Because for the most part, you're going to use them as like a big one pump chump, right? Where they're going to do a lot of damage for one turn, and they're going to kind of struggle to get that next NP, and I kind of, you know, harp on them for that. But at least they're not like Anne and Mary, right? Where it's like literally they dedicate everything to one NP, and even though the damage on that turn is pretty good, I don't think it's worth a waste of your slot, you know, in your team comp. So, you know, she has like a C rating for me because skill 1 pretty much does allow her to at least use her gimmick and be a servant. But aside from that, they definitely need a lot more going in their favor. Now, Astolfo over here, I also have ranked at C-, but a little bit better than Mary over here. Just because Astolfo, I feel like people really gas up Astolfo a lot. Now, understandably, Astolfo is a very cute servant, right? So I understand why he gets gassed up. You know, I got my Astolfo, right? And I'm pretty happy with it. The problem, though, is that we all look at his 50% battery, and this is like one of those cases where, you know, it's like, oh, they have a 50% battery, they gotta be crazy, but it's like, not really. The 50% battery is like the only thing Astolfo's really got going for him majorly, because everything else is just kind of a mess, right? Because he has a good attack buff, but it only lasts for one turn. He has a good chance to stun the enemy, but that's all that skill does. Like, it doesn't lower their quick resistance or give them a quick buff or anything like that to have a bit more utility. It's just a stun, a decent stun, but just a stun. Third skill you're going to be predominantly using for the battery, but then you can also fish out like crit damage or stars with it. The problem is that it's like more chance based, so you could get it one turn and not get it the next. That can be a little annoying if you really want to make him look a bit better. The fact that at least the 50% battery is guaranteed is still very good. And then the other thing that I would actually say that he does have going for him is that when he fires his NP, he gets the coup dodge skill, and it pierces defense with a few stars dropped as well. So it's kind of like give and take with Astolfo. There's like a lot of just like random things thrown in there, and they're like, does it work? And it's like, not really. It's a bit too random. Astolfo hasn't been touched in quite a while, and they probably should come back and fix him up a little bit, because I have no idea why they would leave Astolfo, who's one of like these super popular servants, in this kind of mess right now. So he's just a little all over the place. If you wanted to put him higher in C tier, I wouldn't really mind that at all. Like, if you wanted to be like, well, I think he's a C+ servant because he's got, you know, decent survivability with the coup dodge, and the 50% battery is very, very good. If you wanted to bump him up to the top of C, that's absolutely fine. I just don't think he gets anywhere higher than C tier, right? That's basically what I'm trying to get across. Now, we go back to another phenomenal servant, an A+ servant in Maeve. I mean, I don't even know where do we start with Maeve. Like, she just does so many crazy things, right? Like, for one, she's a crazy buffer for males and Fae allies, technically, because male and Fae allies get 30% NP, but if you're a male, you get a 40% attack buff for 3 turns, and then she is, like, basically immune to debuffs for 3 turns, gets good NP recovery every turn, a little bit of HP every turn. The charm that she has is a little specific to males, which is a little kind of bad. I'm not a big fan of what the charms are like specific, but she still at least smacks them with a good defensive down as well. So it's like, even if you can't charm them, she's still providing more damage by lowering their defense. And then her NP is just a big beat stick, dude. Like, it does pretty decent damage without the anti-male thing, but because the anti-male damage mod starts at 150%, dude, if you're fighting a male, even type neutral, she just smacks him in the face. So not only is she really good against like half the game and just all dudes, but then if you pair her with dudes, she makes a really good support. And then, you know, she herself just functions really well as like a DPS servant if you want to use her in that way as well. So Maeve is just absolutely crazy. Had a very, very insanely good glow up. Can't really say the same about Chad Bro over here. So I have Iskandar at like B minus because unfortunately he's kind of been left behind with the times. The thing that really sucks for Iskandar is that early on in FGO there was two design philosophies. There was we give a servant a big battery, but they don't hit as hard, and then we give one servant really good damage, but no battery. And unfortunately right now, 50% battery for Buster Servants is pretty much needed if you want to be relevant in the Koyanskaya meta, and Iskandar's kind of getting left behind. Now, admittedly, he still hits very, very hard, right? Like, that's very, very good as well. If you have a scope, a maximum broken scope, or even just an 80% scope with his pen skill leveled up, that's also really good for him because then you can pretty much quote-unquote fake him up to 100%, so that can kind of help him out a little bit, but it's not as good as the servants that have the natural 50% because Koyanskaya wants to lower their skill cooldown so they can fire that off repeatedly, right? So that's why you can kind of get him to work in there, but it's not going to be as good as the natural 50% batteries. Now, that being said, if you want to use him as like a pseudo attacker or buffer, like a secondary attacker or something, he works really good with that because he has the modern 20% charisma. He gives 20% NP damage to the entire party for 3 turns. 30% crit damage to the entire party, which isn't super crazy, but it's better than nothing, right? Like 30% is starting to get to that threshold where it's a bit more noticeable, right? And then his third skill makes his NP and his Buster cards insanely strong with it being a 50% Buster buff, and then it gasses up his crit star generation with his high hit NP, basically turning it into a star bomb NP, right? So everything is pretty good. The only unfortunate thing is that he has defense down and like crit reduction down on his NP, but they don't proc first, so you can use it as like a little bit more support. It's like, oh, he lowers the enemy's defense, but it's better for like follow-up NPs or like follow-up cards, but he definitely has the pieces to become a relevant servant again because what he has right now is really good. It's just he's lacking a few extra pieces to make him a bit better. Like, I even think a 30% battery with the pen skill would also help him out a lot because that at least doesn't make him dependent on scopes and makes him more accessible to other characters or other people to use as well. So, that's just kind of my idea for Iskandar. But yeah, B tier, just very solid. I mean, his damage is still very, very good as well. I know I mentioned that, but like, gotta really beat it in that he does hit really hard, and that does help him out a lot as well. But then we move into our first S tier servant in Ozymandias. I mean, I've talked about this dude like repeatedly over the past couple of months. I mean, he's just insanely good after his effects or his rank ups came through because he's got a strong party attack buff with a decent party crit buff of 30%, which I just talked about with Iskandar. He refunds stars every single turn to help people take advantage of those crits. He has guaranteed Imperial Privilege with his third skill, which is a 40% attack and defense buff with a decent heal. Charges the party's NP gauge by 20% and then also guarantees their buffs basically for a turn because he gives them a 40% buff success rate buff for that turn. So if you have other characters like, I don't know, Nero, if you want to use her with Ozymandias, or like Cleopatra, he guarantees their Imperial Privilege, which is super good. Or if for whatever reason you're using him with like Sitanai, you could try to like guarantee Sitanai's buff, just stuff like that, right? NP hits really hard, and then it synergizes with his kit by giving him like the skill cooldown and guaranteeing him the sunlight buff, and the NP seal is like a decent bit of survivability. He's just a very strong, complete package, right? He's very tanky, he hits really hard, he gives a lot of support to the party as well, because even if you're not using him as like a pseudo DPS or like a secondary buffer, the fact that he like charges your support's NP gauge is also really good because Ozymandias would really like it if Merlin or Koyanskaya also got back to their NP because it helps him out a lot. People forget that even though Koyanskaya has a damaging NP, the overcharge of her NP still charges the entire party's NP gauge. So like you still want both her and Merlin to fire off their NPs, and it makes Ozzy even good if you're just using him as the primary DPS. So just a phenomenal rider in every stretch of the imagination. Then we have someone who, Mordred is very hard to rank, so I have her at B+, right? Because we all know that Mordred Rider is really good at looping. She loops things very, very easily. The problem is that she doesn't hit very hard, so it's very hard to guarantee kills on things. And in fact, I've done farming with Mordred Rider where she's refunded 100% of her NP, but killed like 2 of the enemies, or killed like 1 of the enemies, or something like that. And I'm just like, dude, Mordred, come on, man. And unfortunately, I know this is where we're gonna kind of have to talk about this, but when I look at the gold list, I treat all of these servants at NP1. If they were free to play, they'd be a free NP5, but I treat all of them at NP1, and that especially hurts Mordred Rider a lot because her NP damage is already the lowest of all of the gold riders, and then at NP1 it's just super atrocious. It's like 14,000 or something. It is just really, really bad. So even though she's got a really strong kit with like the arts buff, she has a dodge, she has NP gain and a guts, you know, crit star generation rate to kind of help her gen stars as an art servant. She has all these good things. She's just really lacking in damage. And the problem is, I would say, like, oh, we'll just wait for her to get a buff or something, but unfortunately, DW just has, like, some vendetta against the Summer 1 servants and just doesn't feel like they want to buff them at all, because, like, hardly any of them get buffs, like, at all whatsoever. Like, they rarely ever go back to Summer 1, so I don't know what that's about. I wouldn't hold out hope for Summer Mordred to get a buff, but I do have to acknowledge that when it comes to being a looper, she's insanely good at doing her job. It's just kind of following up on said job is what she struggles in. So now we're going to move back to A+. Now, Quetzalcoatl is one that I have really toyed with putting in S tier as well. I've flip-flopped back and forth on it because I think Quetzalcoatl is really, really strong, right? Like, she's basically just like Ozzy 2.0, but with titties instead of abs, right? But I guess she also does have abs as well, so maybe that's just wrong. But anyway, she has a strong charisma at the rare 21% value. You know, she shares it with like Gilgamesh, so you get that extra 1% attack buff, right? That also drops really good amount of stars for immediate use. She has a targetable guts with a good buster buff that's 30% for 3 turns. She has solid star weight, good 50% crit damage that's unfortunately locked to 1 turn, but that's still 50% crit damage, which is essentially what Waiver gives to people, right? So you still get that at least for 1 turn. 30% battery is very good, as I was talking about with Iskandar. It synergizes very well with a pen skill to basically give her a false 50% battery. The thing that I think kind of holds her back is that her NP is really basic. Like, it seals NP, which I think is good, and it applies burn, which I think is kind of bad. I think if they just buff it and kind of just give her stuff like Ozymandias, where they just give her additional buffs, like maybe they give her like a 20% buster buff, right? So that when she has the 30% buff plus her NP, she'll have like a 50% mana burst, right? And she can have that for like 3 turns. I think that would be really interesting. Maybe they just want to smack like NP damage on there to make it harder. I think all of that would be really good. Keep in mind, I did the calcs as well, that if you don't count in like the new like buster buff or like an NP damage buff, right? If you just took Quetzalcoatl as she is right now, but just ranked up the percent of her NP to 800% for like a what a buffed NP would have, she would be hitting basically as hard as Ozymandias would be. So then if they just give her the upgraded NP plus like a 20% buster buff, or you know, just like 30% NP damage for 1 turn, she would be like one of the hardest hitting single target riders in the game, if not like the hardest hitting single target rider in the game without like special damage mods. So she really just needs like a buff to her NP, and I think she's absolutely crazy. Then we go to Rider Alter. So this is one that I'm a little torn on, right? I have her at A- because I think Rider Alter is really good. I just think she's very reliant on Scotty to help her with her consistency, right? But I think everything she does is absolutely fine. Like, decent attack buff, good like quick party charisma thing that she gives, the fact that she can loop her 3rd skill, the fact that she lowers her own skill cooldown. I think those are all really good effects. Her NP hits like an absolute dump truck, right? Like, it does so much damage, right? I think really, if you just buff her, give her a battery so she's not as reliant on someone like Scotty to be consistent, I think it helps her out a lot and just would greatly improve the strength of this unit. Or not even give her a battery, but just give her like NP gain buffs or something, right? Something along those lines, because that's something quick servants really appreciate, is getting an NP gain buff, because if the NP gain buff is decent enough, it basically turns their quick cards into arts cards that can drop stars, right? So I think just give her that buff, and I think she's absolutely phenomenal. Now, you know, if you do want to like take into consideration her use with Scotty, I mean, she's just absolutely nuts, right? So I don't want to go ahead and mention that. I want to go ahead and also talk about Ivan, who should also be in this tier as well. Ivan also gets swept under the rug, but he's literally just like a more challenge quest focused version of Iskandar down there. I mean, the dude's skills are pretty decent, right? Like, he's a high NP gain buff. He has debuff removal to make sure that he's absolutely fine in a challenge quest. He also can remove all enemy buffs as well, which is insanely cracked, right? He gives himself a decent amount of stars per turn, right, with a strong 40% mana burst for 3 turns. You know, so he does pretty decent damage. He has the invincibility for 1 turn to keep himself alive. NP further helps him, you know, as it just nukes the enemy buster resistance, but it doesn't proc first, but it does last for 3 turns. So if you're able to get a second NP, which is highly likely with this high NP gain buff, you know, that second NP will be hitting really hard. And it does give him a just strong 30% NP damage buff as well. So, you know, he's just like a just generically really good challenge quest servant, right? He just does a lot. And like, even putting him at A-, I don't think is really fair. I kind of want to have him at like A or even A+, because I just think Ivan is just like a really, really good servant, right? Like, he's just really good when it comes to boss fights. Like, he hits really hard. He just has generic good buffs. He's able to cleanse his own debuffs and wipe the entire party's debuff or buffs, which is insanely good, because you're just like, oh, they all have like an invincibility. Not anymore, they don't. They have a party-wide dodge because you're fighting David or something. Not anymore, they don't. You know, they're buffing up their critical attack chance and their attack buffs to absurd levels. Not anymore, they're not, right? It's just super crazy. So he could be anywhere from like A to A+, just depending on how, you know, gassed up you're feeling on Ivan. I think he could be A+ potentially, but just to be safe and not, you know, gas him up too much, I'm going to keep him at A- for now. Same thing for Achilles. As you guys will kind of notice, most of these riders are pretty good. Achilles, I think a really good way to just define Achilles is just say he's like Parvati except a rider. And basically what I mean by that is he essentially has the same combo that Parvati has, where Parvati has the ability to give herself like a 30% quick buff and a 20% NP gain buff, right? Achilles basically has the exact same thing, right? He has the 30% quick buff on a skill, and then he has the 30% NP gain buff on a skill as well, but his NP also gives him an additional 20% quick buff. So basically, he has a quick mana burst with 30% NP gain, and he has a 30% battery as well. So like, he's just a really solid like looping servant, trash mob clearing servant. Very good for a lot of that. If you want to bring him to challenge quest, he has a taunt with 2 hits of invincibility that lasts for 5 turns. So, you know, if you never use all of those hits of invincibility, it will last to the next cooldown, which is a nice touch to him as well. The crit damage is fine. Kind of wish it was 50% instead of the 30% that he has. Damage is solid. Just a very, very good, well-rounded servant overall. Do I really need to talk about Reines? I mean, Reines is literally just Waver, but a rider, and her buffs are more defensive, right? Like the fact that instead of giving crit damage to an ally, she gives them just invincibility for a turn. And the thing that I really want to harp on here, because I don't think I need to spend too much time on Reines, because everybody knows Reines is insanely good. The thing that I really want to harp on here is her ability to just make like berserkers take type neutral damage when it comes to fights. I think that is so crazy, because I've used it in so many team comps, right? Where it's just like, the fact that you can just neg your type disadvantage and just make it neutral, even though you still will take decent damage at neutral, and ideally you want to be fighting type advantage, right? Like you want to be bringing a saber to a lancer fight so you take the least amount of damage possible. Neutral for a berserker is way better than them just getting slammed by everything, especially because Reines tries her best to keep them alive. And if it was just her being like, oh, now you just take neutral, that wouldn't be like the craziest thing. But it's the fact that she's like, you take neutral, and then I give you like defensive buffs, damage cut, and give you invincibility. I will do everything in my power to keep you alive. And so I value Reines a lot, and I think she's insanely good. Same thing for Lolly Da Vinci. I mean, I don't think I really need to talk too much about Lolly Da Vinci. Pretty sure we all know that she's just like one of the best, if not the best looper in the game. I mean, she's just absolutely insane with what she does. I mean, the fact that like she gives the party like the overcharge, the NP damage, 10%. She refunds 20% on her first skill, and then her NP refunds NP. Like, it's just NP all over the place. If you need her to dodge something and do a little bit of crits, she has the second skill. I mean, I don't really think we need to talk too much about Da Vinci, because, like, she's just an insanely good looper, and you would think her damage would be worse, but it's actually pretty good. It's around like 21,000, which for how well she loops is insanely good. Essentially, just look at her as like the updated version of Mordred Rider. Like, look at Lolly Da Vinci and be like, Mordred Rider could eventually become that if they just give her another damage buff, right? Like, just buff her NP and give her like, I don't know, like 50% arts buff or something. I don't know, just give her something, right? Bring her up to standard, right? But this is essentially the finalized version, the final evolution, if you will, of Mordred Rider. Then we kind of drop back down to C tier. Now, I don't think Carmilla is like the worst servant in existence, right? Like, I think she's C+. I think she's fine, but I just think they were doing a bit of a weird thing with her, right? Like, if you want to obliterate somebody with crit damage, she's your girl because she lowers like the enemy's resistance to quick, not quick, but just crit damage, like their defense for crit damage by 50%. It's a weird buff, right? Because now we just like lower their crit, I was trying to say crit and quick at the same time. Their quick resistance, right? Or their crit resistance, right? But she specifically lowers their crit defense by 50%, which is really weird. She has a delayed but very good NP charge for the entire party of 25%. Reduces all enemies' defense. NP has AoE buff block, which is pretty good. Reduces their quick resistance. It's just her damage kind of sucks. Like, she's really good if you need someone to like debuff the party. She kind of functions pretty well for that, but it's just like, I don't know, like just bring Scotty instead, or just bring Van Gogh. She's not, there's not really a lot of purposes to bring Carmilla, like unless you just think Carmilla's really hot, or you just kind of want to try her out a few times because she's pretty decent. Like, you'll get some decent mileage out of her. It's just like, I don't know, she's in a very weird class where a lot of the stuff, like, you'll be looking at some of the things she does and you'll be like, okay, but why wouldn't you just lower their defense by 50% instead? Because that would be the same thing, just better. You know, it's just like, I don't get it, man. Like, my head's hurting, man. Like, I don't know, why would you not just do that? So this is a bit of a weird servant. Definitely not poo-poo stinky like on the bottom floor here, but could definitely be better. Could use some buffs. Then we got Europa, who Europa is really good. It's kind of why I was like, hey man, like, where's Europa on the NA version? Because she's a good servant. Like, she's just generic good AoE rider. 30% battery. As I've said in this video, that's just really good. It gives you synergy with the pen skills of a fake 50% battery. She has the coup dodge skill, but with invincibility. So she has Marie's skill, right? But it's on an actual good servant. She has insane 100% debuff resistance for 3 turns, combined with her passive 15%. Basically means when this skill is up, she's not getting debuffed, right? She has a 30% buff to her arts and buster cards, which further helps her NP gain with the arts cards. But the buster buff actually goes up to 50% with the NP, because the NP also has a separate overcharge buff for 20% buster at bare minimum. So like, her damage is going to be fine with like almost like a 3-turn buster mana burst. Her following cards are going to be fine. The AoE charm that also lowers all enemies' defense is pretty good at 20%. Not crazy like some of the other 30% buffs or debuffs that we've seen, but an AoE charm if you use Shooting Doji can be very, very good. And then the fact that even if you don't get the charm off, she can at least smack people with a decent NP because she lowers all their defense. It's just really strong. Like, she's just a generic, really, really good, just AoE buster servant, right? Like, she's just generically very good. The same thing I could really just say for Odysseus as well. Like, I think Odysseus and Europa are just, they're not trying anything too crazy. They're just kind of generically good AoE riders. Like, they're like, here's just a good, generic, solid girl, and here's a good, generic, solid dude. You know, like, here's just 2 guys that are pretty strong, right? Because Odysseus is crazy, right? Because he has a 30% arts buff when you consider his passive 10%, but he gives the entire party that 20% arts and quick, but he himself gets a 30% arts buff because his passive, right? Has a 30% battery, which is solid for reasons I've already mentioned. He's basically immune to charm because he's a 5-turn charm immunity that is on a 5-turn cooldown, so you can't be charmed, which is pretty nice to have. He has decent star weight for a turn when you consider like his skill plus his natural star weight as a rider. If you want to do some crits, that's fine, I suppose, but he's more of a challenge quest based servant, kind of like more, I don't know, utility based guy as well. He has the invincibility plus buff removal resist, which is very similar to Ereshkigal, which means that like not only does he protect himself for a turn, but he cannot have that buff removed from him. So it really just says like he's gonna stay alive for the turn. It also gives him 30% defense for 3 turns as well, that I'm going to mention as well, because even if you bypass the invincibility with like Pierce Invincibility, I mean, maybe that 30% defense will help him live. Like, if you also have other buffs like Mash or Waver, that could be pretty good, because then he could probably live if he's at full HP resisted. Maybe, kind of depends on how hard the enemy is hitting, but that is kind of like some nice foresight that they at least have for his defensive buff. His NP is really solid with it removing all enemies' defensive buffs, which does proc first, which is basically the Shiro Amakusa effect, where basically like if they have invincibility, dodge, defense, he just yeets all of that off of them and gets a good clean hit in. It also gives himself 30% NP damage before he actually attacks as well, which is pretty good. The damage, rather solid, more of a CQ-oriented version of someone like Da Vinci, I would say. Like, If Da Vinci is more around, you know, looping and farming, Odysseus over here is more like centered around taking down challenge quests and more difficult content, right? Like he's definitely designed to be a bit of a more tough cookie, right? Now, that is unlike Murasaki over here, who I have it like just normal B, right? Who's basically just insanely good if you want to use her as like a debuff nicher, because she can seal all enemy NP and skills, lowers their defense for 3 turns, their arts resistance down for 1 turn, 20% battery, 20 star skill. Just kind of weird that like she has this whole debuff thing, but then like the arts down only lasts for 1 turn. The battery probably should be 30%, not 20%, because that's kind of the gold standard right now. At least if you're not going to get a 50% battery, you got to have 30%, right? Unfortunately, the arts defense on the NP doesn't proc first as well, so like they were trying to do some synergy with this with like, oh, so she'll have like arts down on the NP and arts down on a skill, but you know, they didn't give it synergy. Like they didn't let the arts down apply first, so then she could actually hit pretty hard or fall. Like she's basically just there for a follow-up NP, right, for someone else, which is a little unfortunate because you probably want to be using her as your DPS with the way that she's built. The other unfortunate thing is that our NP drain is just a chance, but it's not like, you know, guaranteed like some of the other servants. So it's a little unfortunate. But yeah, just kind of like a solid debuff niche servant. A little bit of flaws here and there, but you could still definitely get the job done with her. You could definitely still use her in a lot of fights. She's definitely fine, just not the best. This one's going to be a little controversial probably, but I'm only having Nemo at A, like not even A+. And the problem I have with Nemo is that he's a bit of a wild card, right? With like, basically all of his skills have things where he wants to be on water side or void battlefield, right? And he's either just a really solid servant or he's absolutely broken. Like Nemo, his ranking should probably be like A to S tier, right? It probably should just be like this question mark, because he just has so much going for him, right? Like he could be giving the party insane arts buffs or maybe just a 20%. He could be giving a little bit of attack, or he could be getting absolutely massive attack. Are you fighting a super large enemy? It all just depends, right? There are some just generic good things that you can mention about him, like the fact that he has the 30% battery with the guts, that then if you proc the guts, he gets a 50% battery again. So like there's just generic, like really good things like that. But there's a bit too much when it comes to situational, like how good he could be, that I'm gonna stick him in A tier. But just know that I like acknowledge that he could be much higher, or he's like somewhere in A tier, right? So Nemo's a bit of a weird servant, but you know, A to S tier, somewhere around there. And then finally, I'm also gonna put Summer Canis in A tier as well. Just has a really good charisma buff that if you're also a male or an unknown gender, you get an additional 30% crit buff, which is pretty solid. 30% to Art and Buster, which is really good for 3 turns. Just makes it really good for doing damage with the Buster cards and being able to refund NP by buffing the arts cards on their NP gain. The Guts is really the Guts is really solid to help her out in staying alive. Star Regen is very solid, and then if you have her on like a water side battlefield, she gets star weight and extra stars, which I think is very important, that she gets the Guts and the Star Regen guaranteed, and it just gets even better if you're on water side, which is I think how it should be built, right? The NP gets good NP damage buff, and it's where her crit damage comes in, because for whatever reason, Canis doesn't have the male or unknown gender trait. She only has the Canis trait, so she doesn't get access to the initial crit buff, which is a little weird, but this is where they give her own crit damage, because her overcharge starts at giving her 50% crit damage for 3 turns, and it just gets higher, right? So she can do really good damage after she starts getting going after like a turn or two. Just a generic, really solid single target rider. So with all that being said, I think that's how I want the list to look. I've probably made a few like slip-ups in there when I was talking. I probably said like single target where I was supposed to say AoE, or I probably said 20% buff when it was 30%, something like that. But that's generically how I want it to look, right? This is how I want the list to look. I'm pretty satisfied with this. Obviously there's the 2 new riders that are coming out like tomorrow or 2 days on JP, but I'm recording this now. I want to do it done. You know, I get in those weird moods where I'm like, I want to record this video today. You know, I ain't waiting. I want to do it now. I'm in the mood. So that's when this got recorded. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. I'll try to remember to put the tier list down there so you can make your own version of this as well. There was no riders that I actually thought were in D tier. Surprisingly enough, if you thought there was going to be any in D tier, you got jebaited, because you know, these are supposed to be like consistent across all the classes, right? Like, and I don't think there's really any D tier rider. I think they're all either just like kind of decent and a little misinformed, or they're just really godly, right? And as you can see, I think the average for riders is quite high. So I am really looking forward to those 2 new servants to come out in the next few days. But on that note, my voice is absolutely killing me. You know, I am just not the throat goat apparently anymore. All right, let me stop. But let me stop and go ahead and get out of here before I say something really sus. But with all that being said, I'm gonna go ahead and get out of here. You guys have yourselves a nice day. Peace, late guys.